Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This session is Sovereignty on Mars, Pragmatic Solutions, Idealistic Models, and Historic Analogs. And our speaker for today is Jacob Heck-Misra from Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. And I would like to give the floor to Jacob.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to to the rest of the talks in this series, and I've been enjoying the talks so far. So I'm going to tell you about some ideas for sovereignty on Mars. We've had a lot of great conversation already about just the idea of sending humans not just to explore space, but someday living long term, long duration in space. And so what I'm going to talk about here is kind of summarizing some of the ideas from my recent book, Sovereign Mars, which you can check out. And so let's get started. I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the main ideas from this book and kind of what motivated the study and where we're going from here. So you look up at the sky. This is hopefully what you've seen at some point in your life. Mars is a point of light. And the reason I showed this is because Mars was not a place that we thought about going for most of human history. It took some time to realize that Mars was a place different from the stars. The planets are these wandering stars. By 1959, this was probably one of the better images of Mars that we have. You've got on the left visible, you can see the ice caps on the north and south pole. On the right is infrared, and so you can see clouds or dust in the equator. And so by 1959, we obviously understood that Mars was a place, but it was not a place that we were going. We weren't sending spacecraft to Mars. We weren't sending robots to Mars. We weren't necessarily thinking about sending people, let alone long duration habitation of Mars. So what changed? Something important changed. And that was the arms race that became the Cold War. And so I show this. This is the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which demonstrated obviously the horrific power of nuclear weapons. But the direct Cold War that resulted between the United States and the Soviet Union primarily, which was an arms race for who could have the greatest stockpile of nuclear weapons and the greatest tactical advantages. This was juxtaposed with a space race, which ultimately led to the United States landing the first people on the moon. These two things are not merely coincidental. In fact, after the nuclear test ban treaty, you saw an acceleration of the space program in a way that made the space program the visible display of a country's rocketry. So when you can no longer detonate a rocket in the atmosphere, or perhaps you don't even want to, what you're doing with the space race, especially during the time of the Cold War, is the United States and the Soviet Union were competing for rocketry dominance, for missile dominance. And you have conversation with senators and talking about closing the missile gap between their adversary and their nation. Space was a vehicle for demonstrating the sophistication of your rocketry. Even if there was a scientific payload on board, it didn't matter because you could swap that out with something else. So, I mean, just look at this. Here on the left, we have an intercontinental ballistic missile made by Boeing. On the right, we have the Falcon 9 rocket made by SpaceX. Well, what's the difference between these two things? Not very much. The main difference is what you put in the top. Do you have a nuclear warhead in the top? Do you have some sort of payload on top, or a crew, or a cargo station, something like that? What are you launching into space? Is your point to launch a payload, to deliver people, transport them? Is your purpose to deliver a warhead for some other military defense offensive purpose? Fundamentally, the technology is the same. And so, say what you want about Elon Musk, the internet is full of criticism. On the right, what we have done is we have decoupled rocketry and nuclear technology. And I think that's a good step because when one of the themes of this book is pragmatism, we live in a world of nuclear weapons. I'm not going to say I like it, but that's the world that we live in. And you can't make them go away very easily at all. And people have tried. So given the fact that we live in this world of nation states competing for nuclear dominance, well, what's a step in the positive direction? I would say this is a step in the positive direction of taking rocketry and decoupling it from nuclear weapons so that we can perhaps still fight a Cold War if we need to, but more in a scientific, exploration focused path instead of focus specifically, at least explicitly, on the military use. But the military use is always there, and you can't pretend that it's not. So here, there's a great picture. This is NASA's Perseverance rover taking a selfie. It's a composite image, and in the background, you can see the Ingenuity helicopter, the drone. So why do we have a small helicopter, a drone on Mars? What was the purpose of this? Well, NASA has a stated purpose. The purpose is to test unpiloted unpiloted flight in the atmosphere of another planet, for the purpose of someday using it for further exploration of sites that are difficult to get to, which we already do on Earth. So that's great. That's a perfectly valid scientific justification. But this picture and this technological feat sends another message. It sends a message to China and Russia saying that NASA, and by extension the United States, has the capability of performing drone flight in the atmosphere of Mars, and they haven't done that yet. So this is a message of technological challenge and in a demonstration of technological superiority that ultimately still connects to the ability to launch and deliver a payload from a rocket and deliver it with precision. And so, I study Mars, I study exoplanets, I'm interested in the history of the solar system. I'm very excited when missions like this find new discoveries. I'm excited for missions to learn more about Mars, but this is a win-win between the sovereignty competition between nation states and the scientific goals of the community. Putting a spacecraft on Mars fulfills just as many political goals as it does scientific goals, and that's the reality that we're in, whether we like it or not. So there was some earlier mention this morning about the Outer Space Treaty. So just to review a little bit, this is the context that we came to the Outer Space Treaty in. It was the Cold War. You had the United States and the Soviet Union competing for missile dominance of space. And so even though we talk about, here on the left, we have Sputnik, on the right, we have Explorer 1, the first, satellites by the Soviets and the Americans to orbit Earth. But, these public feats were, again, demonstrations of the rocketry sophistication, and behind the scenes were a lot of other espionage, the Vietnam War, the spread of communism in Latin America, all of these political events, which I won't talk about here, but I talk about in my book, they are all interwoven, and they're far from disconnected. But so one of the motivations for the Outer Space Treaty was the fear that one of these nuclear powers would expand into space, claim space as its sovereign territory, perhaps claim the moon as the 51st state, or another province of Russia. Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty specifically says that space cannot be space is for everybody in terms of the exploration and the use. So sometimes this gets confused to say that space does not belong to everybody. Space is the province of all mankind, according to Article 1, but specifically it's the exploration and use of outer space that is the province of all mankind. So the Outer Space Treaty does not really make a statement on space belonging or not belonging to anyone, but there's equal access to space. Anyone who wants to go to space cannot be stopped from going to space in terms of the signatories to the treaty. So the exploration, use of outer space should be the province of all mankind. Article 2, you can't claim territory in space as an extension of your sovereign domain. So outer space is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use of occupation, or by any other means. And so here, we have, one of the Apollo astronauts unfurling the flag on the moon. And the US Congress was very specific in the legislation that authorized this to say that this did not constitute a claim of sovereignty, that the United States was not claiming any kind of dominion on the moon. This was simply an act of just symbolic celebration of a national achievement. And you can read about this. There was actually some technical challenges also in putting up a flag in the lunar environment. Nuclear weapons stay on Earth was an important part of this treaty, given the context under which this treaty was framed. So the parties agree not to place in orbit around the Earth objects carrying nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. Now, weapons have been carried into space. There's, obviously utility knives and things of that nature. I believe, I haven't checked on this recently, but at least up until recently, there was a gun in the Russian sector of the International Space Station. But historically, Russian cosmonauts were issued pistols. In the early days of the space race, they would land, their capsules would land in Siberia, and they might be there camping for a few days before they were rescued. And so you needed a pistol to defend against, bears or other wildlife. And this is one that was designed for that, although it's apparently extremely dangerous to fire. And then this is also important. You still own your stuff in space. So Article 8 says that ownership of objects launched into space is not affected by their presence in outer space or on a celestial body or by their return to Earth. And then there's even another separate treaty, the registration treaty, which just kind of formalizes the process under which you would register things that are launched. But the purpose of this is you cannot say that you own the moon. You can't say you own Mars. You can't say you own a section of Mars. But if a space agency were to go and land on Mars and build something there, well, that thing that you built is yours. And so a structure in space does belong. It retains its own original owner. It retains the ownership of the state that launched it there. So this is the International Space Station. And you get into some weird legal territory with the International Space Station because each of the modules and components are owned by different countries, by different nations. And so you have complex agreements and memorandums of understanding to govern the flow of data across the different sectors. And you have, different laws that will apply depending on, where an object is located and whose jurisdiction it's under. So yeah, these are some of the complications that arise. But if you think about building a settlement, you do own the settlement, even if you don't own the ground. You can't claim sovereignty on the ground that the settlement is on. So the Outer Space Treaty has wide acceptance. Some legal scholars would consider it to be customary international law. Not all legal scholars agree with that, but nevertheless, in light gray are the countries that are party to the treaty, so they have both signed and ratified it, and those that are in our dark gray are signatory to the treaty, so they signed but has not yet passed the ratification process. And so the Outer Space Treaty is generally considered to be, one of the primary, if not the only legally, binding forms of international law that apply to sovereignty in space. Now, what I've shown here is all the nuclear powers, and this is important. If you have buy-in from all the nuclear powers, this is actually stronger than just having a majority of nations if the majority does not include many of the nuclear powers. As I said, the space race is really a nuclear race in disguise. It's a substitute Cold War, a substitute arms race where we've just swapped out the nuclear payload with the science payload. And, in one sense, that's better. But, none of these countries that have launch capabilities are blind to the connection. And of course, this is the point, that if you have launch capability, you have launch capability. You can launch a payload for science or telecommunications. You can launch a payload for a military purpose. And now I have included North Korea and Pakistan on here, not because they're space powers, but just to show that the fact that those two countries have invested so heavily in developing nuclear capabilities is testament to the fact that we're still in an age where being a country with nuclear capabilities is a major bargaining chip in the geopolitical arena. And so those countries are not going to dictate space policy, but certainly you may see more countries striving toward nuclear technologies in order to be taken seriously, if not also for the pursuit of space launch capabilities. So the Outer Space Treaty is the only successful treaty about ownership in space. We did have the Moon Agreement in 1979, which has some signatories. So this, a lot of people like the Moon Agreement. This would have gone a little further. Say, in a sense, you could maybe say space belongs to everybody in this sense, that the moon and its natural resources would have been the common heritage of mankind, requiring some sort of equitable sharing. There would be an international agency, an international regime to govern the exploitation of natural resources on the moon, and there would be equitable sharing of those resources. So many people like that idea, but this was not quite as popular. As you can see, there's a handful of countries that are party to this treaty. Recently, it did receive the minimum number of signatories and ratifications to come into effect. But as you can see, almost none of the spacefaring, countries with launch capabilities have signed on to the Moon Agreement. France and India have signed but not ratified this. Australia has a space program, but no launch capabilities as of yet. And so many legal scholars consider the Moon Agreement to be a dead treaty, although the countries that have ratified the Moon Agreement are bound by it. And so we will see if there's any movement. There so far has not been an international regime constructed under the guise of the Moon Agreement, but we will see what happens with that. So what I'm interested in is asking, are there other examples of cooperative sovereignty on Earth that we could apply to Mars? If the Outer Space Treaty is it, well, okay, that's at least better than nothing. But it was written in a very different time, in a time when we were worried about the expansion of the nuclear powers into space, not when we were thinking about private space agencies thinking about sending civilians for short or long-term duration stays in space. So what else can we learn from cooperative sovereignty examples? That's sovereign nations working together in a way that does not necessarily cede their sovereignty in an unfavorable way, but still recognizes that there's problems in which you would otherwise have encroaching sovereignty. So we have the law of the sea is an interesting example, and I'll just go through these pretty quick, but you can certainly read more about it in my book. So the law of the sea looks pretty successful. There's the conspicuous absence of the United States. Also missing is Venezuela, Turkey, and Israel. There's some landlocked states there that maybe don't matter quite as much given the law of the sea. But now the main objection of those four states was the requirement for equitable sharing of proceeds from deep sea mining. And this is kind of an ongoing issue right now, but the US abides by many of the other provisions of the law of the sea other than that. But this is one of the themes, is that equitable sharing as a mandate is unlikely to gain universal participation, and that was certainly a problem for the law of the sea. But you can at least think about some of the other provisions of the law of the sea that are more, globally recognized. You've got this kind of provision where you ask yourself, well, who owns the sea? Well, maybe nobody owns the whole ocean, but 12 nautical miles out from land is a territorial sea where a nation can exert its own sovereignty as if it were land. Beyond 12 nautical miles from there is a contiguous zone where you can exert sort of military, defense, but you don't own, that you don't have sovereign authority entirely over that part of the ocean. 200 nautical miles from the land is an exclusive economic zone where the country has exclusive rights for mining, fishing, science, things like that. Another country would have to get permission to do anything of that sort in their exclusive economic zone. But everyone else has free right of passage. You can't stop another country from sailing through your exclusive economic zone. And beyond that is the high seas that can be owned by nobody. And so, you could think about doing something like this on Mars. You've got your settlement, your contiguous zone, your EEZ, your frontier. Nobody owns anything, but maybe you could, through an agreement or some way, or just even precedent from the bottom up, just common practice could lead to something like this, which is in fact what happened with the law of the sea. This was very much a bottom up set of practices that was later codified as law rather than invented from the top down. This system has certainly been exploited to some extent. France and the United States have the greatest amount of EEZ in the world, which you don't even think of them as nautical states. But so you do get, if you're getting that benefit, there's certainly nations that are going to go after that. You have case studies where, China has signed on and ratified the law of the sea, but they still, conduct economic activities in this 9-line area that interferes with the Philippines EEZ, and China has been non-responsive to the International Court of Justice rulings that say that they're not supposed to do that. The Antarctic treaty system is a complicated one. I don't have time to explain everything, but you have some countries that have stated claims or reserved claims to sovereignty in Antarctica, some countries that have no claims but are part of the treaty system. And being part of the treaty system, which is outside the guises of the UN for intentional reasons, being part of it actually requires you to have an active scientific presence in Antarctica. It doesn't have to be your own base. It could be a collaboration. You notice the absence of almost all African states, perhaps because there's fewer resources or desire to invest in scientific exploration in Antarctica. And so you could imagine that being some sort of a precedent on Mars, for better or for worse, that's been applied on Earth. And then, there's an interesting case study where Australia has actually attempted to exert sovereignty over its parts of Antarctica, which are officially suspended. Their sovereign claims are suspended under the terms of the treaty. Australia has nevertheless tried to enforce this, and there was a case where Japan was whaling in Australia's claimed part of Antarctica, and this was brought to the Federal Court of Australia, and Japan didn't want to show up for that. And so you do get tensions like that even under the Antarctic Treaty System, where some nations have a desire to enforce sovereignty, where others are trying to have this sort of, science park where sovereign claims are suspended. But the history of Antarctica is complicated, and there are a lot of national interests in maintaining those sovereign claims for the future. You could think about, applying some sort of park system on Mars. Maybe there's some areas, where the pluses are where there's historical landers, that maybe you want to protect Olympus Mons or the, Valley Marineris or something like that. So, you could imagine things like that, where certain regions of Mars are designated either for science only, or maybe not even for intrusive science, just for preservation purposes. I talk about a more radical idea, though. What if, the Martians were to own Mars? The Martians, and who are the Martians? Well, the people who move to Mars. Perhaps we talk about something like planetary citizenship, and you can only gain money and power on your one planet. Earthlings can't interfere with Mars without agreement of the Martians, and you can't, you can give gifts, but you can't make demands. And so, maybe this could be an idealistic way of allowing civilization to sort of adopt new experiments on Mars. And so I'm not going to get too much into this, but some themes from the book as I come to a close here are 3 pragmatic constraints. This is the working hypothesis. I don't think we're going to have a world space agency, because I don't think that the major spacefaring states are going to relinquish jurisdiction over their space activities to a new agency. You might like the idea. I don't think it's going to happen with everyone. You're not going to get the US and Russia and China all to agree to that, so it's not going to be effective. I don't think you're going to have mandatory redistribution, because you won't gain complete participation, and then the treaty will be ineffective. You won't have new treaties, I don't think. I think you might get things like Artemis, which are these bilateral accords.
Jacob,
Sure.
I have to interrupt you because we have 5 more minutes left until the session ends, and we have a couple of questions here.
Oh, sure. I'll get right to the end. I'm just about done. So yeah, I don't think we'll have new treaties. Again, for the same reason. This could be wrong, but I think what has to be true is your idea has to be technically feasible, or it won't work in space. Has to be politically feasible. You can't ignore SpaceX. You can't make the major countries go away. You can't pretend there's no nuclear weapons. And it has to be long-term sustainable, or it won't work, because space exploration is long-term. So this is the view. When we get to Mars, I have more to say in the book about how this might transform our way of thinking about ourselves and our civilization. And yeah, you can check out the book for more. So thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. So we have a couple of questions here. One is from Sarah. China isn't abiding by this law of the sea according to Philippines. I guess it's a comment more than a question.
That's right. No, so for that case study, yeah, so this is an example where you can get countries signing and ratifying a treaty, but not always abiding by it. So this is a choice. You can sign a treaty and then ignore it. And in this case, yeah, the Philippines did bring about a challenge to China under the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice ruled that China should not be conducting fishing activities in the Philippines exclusive economic zone, and China did not change its practices. It does not recognize the validity of that ruling. So this is a problem that could happen in space too. We have the Outer Space Treaty. That doesn't guarantee that a state will abide by it in all cases. And then the consequences of not abiding by a treaty are not clear. They're political consequences based on how other nations respond. There's no authority.
Thank you. Another question is also from Sarah. Why hasn't the US done anything about China planning on going to the South Pole? Doesn't that allow China to own ice? Do you think that China is going to share ice so that it can be converted into water and hydrogen?
That's an interesting question. I will admit I don't know a lot about that, so I will look it up. But what I will say is that under the Antarctic Treaty System, there are no sovereign claims that are enforced. They've all been suspended, and China is not one of the countries that has a sovereign claim. It's the Norway, UK, France, Chile, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand. So those are the countries that have interest politically in Antarctica, a little bit US and Russia. So whatever China is going to do, if you take a little, I'm not sure again what's happening, but if you were to remove some ice or do some experiments, that's fine. If they're doing scientific experiments, that is the main that's the main activity that is allowed in Antarctica. There's no military or commercial activities that are allowed in Antarctica. And then commercial activities, there's a moratorium until I think 2045 in Antarctica. So if China's planning serious commercial activities, they would have to wait, or there would be significant international backlash against that because that's forbidden by the treaty. But I'll look into the issue. I don't know the details about that, so thank you.
One more question, and that will probably be our last one. Well, we'll see. We have 3 more minutes. When should a space court based in the US start?
Sorry, when should a space what?
Space court.
Space court. Oh, so that's interesting. So I don't know that we would have a separate court in the US, but what you would have is domestic laws. So the Outer Space Treaty and the other treaties, those are all part of international law, and those are binding to countries. So for individuals, yeah, it's domestic law. It wouldn't necessarily be a separate court system. They'd just be different laws. Should there be laws for private space companies about planetary protection or about safety for civilian astronaut passengers or things like that? And then so if there was a law like that, or even just there's not a law, but there's been these cases where space debris from SpaceX has, fallen and hit in a building or something like that. Then there's liability involved in that. Even if there's not a separate law, there's just liability from existing laws that we have. So yeah, we don't need a new court, but what we are going to see is existing courts are going to have more space-related cases, and there might be more space-related laws passed by national and state legislative bodies.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you everybody for joining. We have to end the session, but we have sessions going on throughout the day in different rooms. So please check our website. And our next session will be at 2:10. So you can all come and join. Bye-bye.
Thank you.